Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited you are here and have chosen to join this discussion for our first breakout session of the summit. I am thrilled to introduce a few presenters this morning on our first breakout session titled Reimagining the Teaching Role: How Strategic Staffing Can Attract and Retain Effective Teachers. We're here today in the research and policy strand, and I'm excited to introduce you to a few folks who will be talking today. First is Shannon Holston, the Chief of Policy and Programs at the National Council for Teacher Equality, joined by her colleague, Michael Sheehy, Senior Policy Analyst that we had a chance to hear from earlier this morning, also at the National Council on Teacher Equality. And they're joined by Leah Sutton, who is the Advanced Teaching Roles Program Lead at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So I'm going to pass it over to the presenters to get us started. And also I'm going to encourage participants to, join us on video if you can. We'd love to see you and get to know you, and encourage you to drop your comments and your questions in the chat throughout the discussion. Michael and Shannon and Leah will be leaving time for Q&A at the end of our session today. They'll be pulling questions from the chat, so feel free dropping those in, and we're eager to hear your thoughts and your discussion here as well. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it over to Michael, Shannon, and Leah.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks everyone for joining us today and fitting this session into your busy schedules. We know you have a lot of options to choose from throughout the summit, and so we appreciate you choosing to spend your morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, with us today. We're excited to be here to discuss the results of our national analysis that we conducted, exploring how states can help or hinder the ability of districts to reimagine the teaching role, and also share some other resources and case studies with you along the way. Over the last 2 years, we've done a lot of research and looking at state and district policies. And with that, we launched an interactive website and tool. I think Michael will drop that in the chat, titled Reimagining the Teaching Role. And we'll dive into that in a little bit and share a bunch of resources. But check that out because it really does have a number of good information for you to try and understand the policy landscape and how policy might affect implementation. For our session today, first, I'm going to give an overview of some of the key findings, and then Michael will lead a discussion with Leah Sutton, who leads the North Carolina Advanced Teaching Roles work, to share some more about this from the state perspective. So throughout our presentation, please feel free to ask questions, and we'll dive in. So as you might have heard in the opening session, if you were there, from Michael, we often use these terms interchangeably, like strategic staffing, strategic school staffing, reimagining the teaching role. So throughout the presentation, you might hear me use those terms interchangeably, but really what we mean is about disrupting the traditional model of the one teacher, one classroom, and instead think about the teaching role that emphasizes strategies like teams of teachers working together to provide instruction for larger groups of students, or paying highly effective teachers more for taking on additional students, or developing teacher roles where a teacher oversees a team of teachers, or a combination, and most likely a combination of a bunch of key elements. And really, when we started out this project, we kept coming back to this Ford Model T metaphor about, like, the Ford Model T 100 years ago was breakthrough technology, but it wouldn't serve us well today. And unfortunately, our classrooms in a lot of places still look the same that they did 100 years ago. And this traditional classroom model just isn't working for a lot of teachers and students. And we need to start to think differently. So we set out to kind of answer this question: does state policy help or hinder a district's ability to reimagine roles or implement strategic staffing models? And so we also thought about, like, well, why reimagine teaching? Like, there's a lot of things to focus on. There's a lot going on in the world, as we all know. And so why focus on reimagining teaching? And a couple of data points I want to share kind of rose to the top. One, We know that there's some job dissatisfaction among teachers, that only 26% of teachers agree that the teaching profession is dynamic, meaning that there's role flexibility and opportunities for growth. We know that a lot of schools are experiencing teaching staffing challenges, and more so for schools that teach large percentages of students from low-income families or students of color, they experience these staffing challenges more. We also know that teachers want a more collaborative workforce. So from some teacher surveys, we know 63% of teachers want more time to collaborate, and over 80% of teachers are open to co-teaching or team teaching models. And we also know our workforce is changing. So if you asked 35 years ago, if you asked a teacher, how many years of experience do you have? The most common answer would be 15 years. And in a study they did in 2016, if you ask that same question, so, within the last 10 years, the answer would be 1 to 3 years. So we have a much different, much more less experienced workforce. And so we need to think about how are we creating teaming structures and supports to keep teachers in the profession as well. And most importantly, we want to know, how does this affect student outcomes? And really, early evaluations show that not only does it improve teacher satisfaction and teacher retention, but also student learning. And some models have even equated to an extra half year of learning for students. And I'll share some other results throughout the presentation as well. So all in all, I think, teaching satisfaction, teacher retention, student outcomes all look great. I'm not going to go into this in depth. I think we've mentioned a couple of examples of like, what could it look like? I think the biggest challenge for me, talking to a lot of policymakers that I've learned over the past year or so, is that if you're doing it right, it kind of looks a little different in each district or each school. And so while there are certain elements or models, I think that's one of the challenges, to try to explain, well, what is it? And so I think this is a strategy where seeing is believing. So if you haven't gone to a place that is implementing this, I would highly encourage you, if you're somebody new that's exploring this, to go like see it in action. I think that gives you the best understanding of what these strategic staffing models look like. So the role of state policy, as I mentioned, we really start out like, how does state policy help or hinder the ability of districts to do this? And as Michael noted in the opening session, the kind of assumption was, state policy is a barrier and is only occurring in certain places. And so, what is really the landscape? And what we really found, the headline is that state policy overall isn't really a major barrier. We'll highlight a few examples in a minute, but more so, I think what we saw was kind of a missed opportunity for states to explicitly focus on reimagining the teaching role or strategic staffing as a strategy to impact, the retention of great teachers. And so what did we find? So there are some opportunities for states, more opportunities for states to support strategic staffing models and are currently being put into place. One thing that we found is less than half of states allow for innovation zones, where districts apply for waivers from existing policy to help implement strategic staffing models. This is a strategy that doesn't cost money, but it creates a space where districts could easily apply for waivers and to not let some of those policies get in the way. Only 14 states offered grants that could be used by districts to innovate with strategic staffing models. This is a strategy used in a lot of as far as like change theory, in terms of, starting to, as states, to like seed some funding and some opportunities. While strategic staffing is, the goal is more for it to be cost neutral, that you're using the resources within your school or district. There is some upfront costs around some technical assistance and some planning and things like that. So some seed funding could go a long way in terms of helping districts rethink their models. And then just a few states, 8 states, provided some type of supplemental pay for teacher leadership roles beyond mentoring novice or aspiring educators. So that's another way, in terms of thinking about teacher leadership, like states could engage. So overall, there's some ways that states could seed innovation and help kind of just create the space for districts to try out new things. I mentioned earlier that overall we didn't find state policy to really be a barrier, but we did identify kind of 4 aspects of state policy that could be a barrier depending on what state you live in, quite frankly. And these are the 4. I'm going to just go briefly what we found. So the first area is class size. And while well-intentioned, class size and student-teacher ratios can be a barrier to implementing strategic staffing models because they can be overly restrictive. So in some cases, these policies may specifically say, like, does not allow more than one adult in the same classroom to be assigned to support students or something like that. That's really specific. And we also found in some instances it could prohibit a highly effective teacher from taking on additional students, even with additional support and pay and agreement of the teacher. So we really encourage states at the state level to have a waiver process. And we found that 5 states don't have that currently. So something to check into your state. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Another area that we found, we call teachers as observers. So, creating these meaningful leadership opportunities requires flexibility of teachers to often serve as team leaders. And as a team leader, teachers need to have the ability to observe and guide their teams. Teams might consist of teachers, paraprofessionals, residents. And we found some policies restrict teachers the ability to observe other teachers. And so we know that team leaders can often provide the content specific, consistent, ongoing feedback that quite frankly doesn't happen in a lot of schools across America today. So this is something to keep in mind, that I think one thing we're just trying to raise is that perhaps state policy isn't a place where that should exist. That should be something that's discussed more at the local level about how those observations occur, and to not restrict that ability or allow some type of waiver process to occur at the state policy level. Similarly, team outcomes, and I think somebody in the opening session raised this in terms of, obviously states have an interest in tracking student progress and linking it to specific teachers and measuring student growth. We believe we should be measuring student growth and paying attention to that. But the state policy needs to be flexible to allow local districts to make that decision around having the ability to create team-based accountability if they so choose. And so again, we're kind of saying, either allow that or be silent on at the state level and allow those discussions to have more occur at the local level. So because team-based accountability is an element and in a number of strategic school staffing models. And the last area that we kind of dove into is restrictions on the use of support staff or teacher time. So we found in some states that there were some restrictions on what paraprofessionals could do in terms of instructional activities. And we also found, and this could hinder the ability of a district to think creatively about how do we use all adults in the building to best meet student needs and to be able to support students and teachers. And then we also found some places where state policy limited planning time, like called for self-directed planning time. And so that could be a barrier in terms of thinking about how teams have time to collaborate and work together. Again, just thinking that should be more at the local level. So all in all, we found state policy not to be a barrier, but there are some instances where words matter and could create, barriers for districts who want to do innovative things. We did find that in order to implement these models, there's a number of roles for everyone to play, from state leaders to district leaders, ed prep programs, and advocates. So on our website, we have at least 3 case studies in each of these roles, and I encourage you to check those out because they really kind of tell the story of how things were implemented and people's perspectives. And they're all a little different. So just wanted to highlight that and encourage that depending on where you are and where you sit in your role and how this might impact you. To highlight a few recommendations, these are on our website, but just want to highlight a few. For state leaders, we really want to think about, how can you seed innovation or create flexibility or a waiver process? We want districts to have a well thought out plan. Of course, we don't, but I think states could also help seed innovation and also help monitor the results. Another thing I want to highlight from a state perspective is the ability to fund, if you do fund a grant opportunity, also fund the research or evaluation that would go along with that. So I think there are a number of instances where, for example, Ector County in Texas contracted with Texas Tech to do an outside evaluation every year for 3 years. And that's been not only informative for them to keep getting better at implementing the models and expanding within their district, but it also revealed that implementing the model was led to increases in student learning for all students, but particularly their English learners. And I think that was like a really good moment that all their hard work and way that they thought about working together differently has paid off for all kids, and particularly kids that have been traditionally underserved. So we do have a good research base, but we need more in terms of like understanding elements of the model and the impact and outcomes. A couple other for district leaders. I really want to preface this of start with a coalition of the willing. If we heard one thing across everybody that we talked to, this is it. Like, start with a coalition of the willing. In no place that we talked to was it, oh, this is going to be in every school next year, or anything like that. It is starting with a school leader and a group of teachers who are really interested in this, and then building and expanding across the district over time. So that is one thing that I would really emphasize. Another thing I would emphasize is choosing a partner. Districts may have the want to, but there are very few people who have the skill or experience who have done this before. And so choosing a partner to help districts and schools plan, most all have taken a year of planning process. And I think this is one time where in education, we always feel the urgency to do right by kids, but this is also a strategy that takes some thought and really thinking about resource allocation. And so would also just preface that if you're an advocate in this space, there's lots of different things that we saw advocacy organizations do. Leah also worked at Best NC, who's played a major role in North Carolina before she went to the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. But there's lots of ways for advocates to engage, like build networks of districts and interested in the work, sponsor site visits, create a shared space where you can support districts that are implementing, where they can come together and share their lessons learned. So lots of ways to get involved. We're happy to continue to talk about that or share anything after the session or anytime. I want to highlight 2 companion resources quickly. One, we have state specific profiles. So if you're interested in like, all right, what is on the books in my state? Check out the website. We have state specific profiles along with some recommendations. For those of you who might live in a state that says like, this is great, but we have like collective bargaining and we think that might be a barrier, we did create some recommended teacher contract language. It is by no means like a plug and play, but it does give you a place to start of the 5 areas that we found like could be a barrier, and gives you some language to start with and some questions that you could use in terms of talking with your district teams and your community stakeholders with to start the conversation. So those are 2 resources that we wanted to highlight. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Michael now to dig in and have a conversation.
Fabulous. Thank you, Shannon. And as Shannon said, thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate. We've got a great group of folks here. So excited that you all are here learning with us. I'm joined today by a special guest. For those of you who may not know, North Carolina has emerged as a national exemplar when it comes to reimagining the teaching role. The state's Advanced Teaching Role Initiative creates distributed leadership roles and opportunities for higher pay for effective teachers, while simultaneously providing those teachers with embedded professional supports, particularly for novice teachers. And so I am joined today by Leah Sutton, who is the Advanced Teaching Roles Program Lead at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Prior to joining the department, Leah was Vice President of Policy Engagement for Best NC, a nonpartisan nonprofit group of business leaders advocating for educational transformation in North Carolina. At Best NC, Leah helped champion the Advanced Teaching Roles Program from the advocacy side of the table, advocating for policy improvements and additional investments. Leah is a native of Eastern North Carolina and began her career as a public school teacher. Leah, thank you so much for joining us. I want to just dive right in the interest of time. But given that we have folks probably with a wide range of perspectives and knowledge, I was hopeful that you could walk some folks on the through who may be less familiar. Can you provide just a brief overview of the Advanced Teaching Roles Initiative and the issues that North Carolina is seeking to address through the program?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. Nice to be with you, Michael and Shannon. Thank you for including me in this conversation. And happy to see a couple of folks from North Carolina in the group. So, um, advanced teaching roles began in North Carolina in 2016. So, we're approaching a decade of doing this work, and are really thrilled that the national conversation around strategic staffing has grown so much, because we really have found it to be an important initiative, an important way to strengthen our teacher pipeline here in North Carolina. As Michael mentioned, I was on the advocacy side of this work for several years, lobbying for this program and the policy at the General Assembly, and now have shifted just last month into helping lead the program from and lead implementation of the program from the state agency side. So in 2016, with advanced teaching roles, we were really seeking to solve a couple of problems. We had, a really lagging teacher pay structure in North Carolina due to pay freezes that happened over the recession, and we were really seeking to find a way to raise pay and also find a way to specifically try to retain some of our best teachers, specifically raise pay for those best teachers. So the General Assembly passed a pilot program, and it was inspired by some work out of Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, where they had begun a privately funded philanthropic endeavor to try to turn around some of their neediest schools. And one of the things they did was implement opportunity culture models. And it was really a big success. And of all the interventions that the private philanthropic group funded, this was one of the ones that everybody was really most excited about. And so Betsy went to the General Assembly and said, this seems to be working. Let's try to pilot it in other places across the state. So the General Assembly passed a pilot program in 2016 with essentially seed funding, seeding districts to say, hey, if you're interested in thinking about staffing models and new compensation models for teachers, apply for this grant. And so it was originally open to 10 districts who applied to become pilot sites. And then it has since become a statewide program. So now there's a pot of money that's recurring that districts can apply for grants. It's an annual opportunity. And we have about, as of now, 35 districts, and we have 115 districts in North Carolina. So we're about a third of districts in North Carolina have opted in. Now, to Shannon's point earlier about slow implementation, the districts are not saying, hey, we're doing this and now we're going statewide. They're starting small. They're opting in and getting a grant, starting small and doing a handful of schools each year as they slowly expand. But Charlotte Mecklenburg, which started in 2013, is now almost district wide, and they have close to 200 schools because they've slowly expanded and the district has really seen the benefits of the program. So from a state policy perspective, the advanced teaching roles grant money is used to essentially mostly used to purchase technical assistance or to support the design and implementation of advanced teaching roles. And for the most part, schools and districts are coming up with a salary supplement money for teachers within their existing budgets. And so the state is working on how do we support districts in this work, and we're managing the growing interest in this initiative in our state. So Michael, there's more to say, but hopefully that's a good overview.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, much better than I could have done. I'm curious, Leah, and you touched on this a bit, but just I know we've got a lot of like data folks on the call. What sort of impacts has North Carolina seen since implementing, and kind of as it continues to scale the initiative? What kind of changes have you all seen statewide?
Yeah, so Shannon mentioned the importance of evaluation as one of the recommendations. And so the state investment in advanced teaching roles has really done two things. One, it's seeded or it's incentivized districts to really start thinking about this. And those early districts were the ones that were either just really innovative, had a really innovative leader, or were really, really desperate for a talent pipeline solution. And so the state grant funding incentivized them to be bold early on, and now we've built enough interest, and now it's incentivizing others to kind of get on board. I'm hearing about this thing, I'm getting a grant that's helping me enable me to really spend time thinking about it. So the state money has also really been important for the evaluation process. So with the pilot program, the state required an evaluation. And now even with the permanent program, the state has required an evaluation. And so we've been able to see that in the pilot, and currently we're seeing really excellent results in schools. Right now we're able to look at school-wide impacts. So if you're an advanced teaching role school and we're comparing you to non-advanced teaching role schools, and we're seeing positive impacts on student growth and student achievement, we have not yet seen those impacts on teacher retention that we really hope to see. So we're really hoping that that's going to come. Just being really honest with you all, we're hoping that's going to come in the next couple of years. But we're seeing student outcomes, which is really exciting. And what's also exciting is that we're seeing student outcomes school wide. So even in a situation where you've got a couple of teams in a school, but not everybody is reached by the teacher team and the teacher leadership models that are being established, we're still seeing impacts across the entire school, and especially in math. So it's exciting. And this upcoming evaluation, we're drilling down deeper to look at the specific teams. So we're hoping we're going to see even greater impacts. One sort of tip is if you did want to do this and you did want to invest in an evaluation in your state, I think it's really important to invest in the evaluation, because the pilot evaluation was the grounds that we used to say, hey, let's make this an ongoing opportunity. And now that it's an ongoing opportunity, we're asking for more teacher pay money. And so we're using that evaluation with the policymakers in particular every year, and it's been hugely helpful. But if you're going to do evaluation, try to early on set up your structures for how you're going to get the data you need from the districts, because we found out along the way that they weren't collecting all the data we needed for the evaluation, and it's been a little bit of a painful trying to go back and get that. So that's just a little tip.
Yeah, that's really fabulously and really speaks to how like North Carolina, excuse me, how North Carolina has been able to like leverage this evaluation to like further establish those proof points to allow the state to continue to scale, to continue to ask for continual investment, and such fabulous advice. I want to ask that, given ATR's scale, I know you all have some statewide goals to continue to expand statewide implementation over the next, I think, decade or so. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the policy conditions that you all, either at your time at Best NC, in partnership working with the state, what sort of policy conditions do you believe have allowed for ATR to really flourish? And like, what sort of challenges did you all kind of have to meet along the way?
So politically in North Carolina, this sort of really started at a time where we have a Republican-led General Assembly. And so they were really looking for ways to connect teacher pay increases to student outcomes. And so, we've been able to make a case through the evaluation that strategic staffing is benefiting students. And it's also happening in the places where the most needy schools, like 85% of schools, there's about 450 schools this year doing ATR in North Carolina, and 85% of those are Title I. These are very needy schools. And so we're seeing impacts with sort of our most underserved populations, which is really encouraging. And we're able to help target funds to those schools by having these roles and having teacher pay increases sort of attached to these places that really need the support. So that was really compelling for our policymakers. I think creating a pilot program where districts opt in, and Shannon mentioned this too, is like, districts opt into this program. No one is required to do this. Like, I could see that maybe down the line if we've got like 10 straggler districts who don't want to do it. But for now, it's really opt in. I'm an innovative district. I'm interested in this as a talent solution. I'm receiving funds to do it. And then we're kind of working at the department now on sort of the accountability of how we're monitoring that over time. But making it an opt-in has been really helpful. You mentioned class size, Shannon. In North Carolina, we have a very rigid K-3 class size law. And so one of the things that the General Assembly has done is allow for class size flexibility in grantee districts. That's really critical because You have to be able to move positions around and pull teachers out of teaching. We're not creating new positions with this. So we are changing the existing positions that we have. And so by not creating new positions, you have to think about how you can reallocate students across the staff in order to provide release time to teachers so that they can do the leadership work that they need to do. And the release time is really critical. And I would just say to everyone that, you really need to try to be firm on how you can't expect this to have the impacts that you want if you're just going to say to a teacher, like, do this thing after school for an hour every day. That's not, you have to give them time during their school day to do it. So the class size flexibility has been really important. The grant funding has been really important politically. One thing that has happened in sort of our messaging over time that might be useful to people is when we first started really just talking about retention and veteran teachers and giving them a leadership, an advancement opportunity. Still compelling, it's still important. But also what's happened in the last 10 years is our teacher pipeline has changed really dramatically. And we have a surge in emergency license and alternatively prepared teachers. So now we're really messaging it more to, hey, district, or hey, policymaker, we have these emergency licensed people. Now we're able to put them on the team with a veteran, experienced, effective teacher whose job it is to make sure they're giving the right instruction to their students and to help them get the sort of professional development they need to be successful. So we kind of changed our message, evolved our messaging, and you kind of have to be willing to do that as an advocate. But definitely the grant funding and the class size flexibility are the two biggest policy pieces that I think are important.
Thanks, Leah. I just dropped a note in the chat that we should hopefully have time for hopefully a couple questions before the end of the session. So feel free to raise your virtual hand if you know how to do that on Zoom, or just drop a question in the chat and we'll try to get to any and all that we have time for. But Leah, while folks are hopefully racking their brains on if they have questions for you or Shannon or I, I'm curious, and I'm going off script a little bit here, but financial sustainability is such a huge concern for stakeholders based at every level. And I know it's a concern for folks in North Carolina. I'm curious, what considerations did North Carolina have to grapple with, that BestNC had to grapple with, to make these models possible and to continue to scale this work statewide?
So that's been kind of an evolution for us and for BestNC and for the state of North Carolina. But under the original pilot program, the salary supplements were required to be supported within existing budgets. So there was no state funding for salary supplements for teachers in these leadership roles. And the grant money was really targeted specifically for design and implementation of your model. So district could pay, like, for a person, an FTE at the central office to support ATR, but they couldn't pay the teachers their salary money. And so the schools were and are using local funding or Title I resources for to create those salary differentials for the leader teachers. And in North Carolina, we have a pretty rigid resource allocation funding model that doesn't give districts a lot of flexibility to pull from different pots of money to fund salary. And we also have, like, a pretty low funding effort. So over time, what happened is that we realized the districts and the schools could sustain a minimal number of positions with their own funding, but there was really a limit. And so if we thought about a school and we thought we want every teacher in the building to be on a leader's team and to be getting that day-to-day embedded professional support, we're going to need more money. So in 2023, we went to the General Assembly, BestNC went to the General Assembly and asked for additional salary supplement money for the state, for all the districts in the state. And so that was granted. They gave us about $11 million, and we already need more because more schools are being added every year. But so the state was sort of like really stamping ATR as this great practice by providing that salary supplement money that's really earmarked for every teacher who's in one of these positions, get this state money. And then we're encouraging districts to layer on top any resources they can. For example, using Title I money to make salary supplements larger in Title I schools. So it's been a little bit of an evolution, but sustainability is critical. And there's in North Carolina, at least, there's a level that could be sustained in budget. And then we wanted to go farther. And so that's why we asked for more state money.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Leah. I know in Shannon and I's our research, conversations around funding emerged quite often in the case studies we did with districts and groups nationally. The desire to be budget neutral is a constant concern. So it's really nice to hear how you all kind of navigated those challenges and continue to navigate those challenges.
Yeah, and Michael, I'll just add that the budget neutral part was a huge selling point early on. So, I mean, that just got legislators' attention. Like, you can do this thing and it won't cost it. We said the grant money is one-time money, right? A district gets a grant for its grant terms and then it goes away and they can do this in budget. And we said that for a long time. So internally as an organization, it was really hard for BSNC to pivot to this. Well, now we know that we can do it in budget, but if we want to really extend the reach, we're going to have to go far, get some more state money. So for a pilot program, if you wanted to start a pilot program in your district, you may want to sell it as budget neutral. You may want to just think about the benefits of saying that it's budget neutral, and figuring out navigating that over time. Brian put in the chat, Brian Hassel from Public Impact, who leads opportunity culture work, put in the chat that in other states, they've found a lot of flexibilities and things that allow them to do these models have a really good reach with these models without the state money. In North Carolina, we can't trade positions. And so we can't use a vacant position to fund salary supplements and things like that. So we were hitting our head against the wall, and our General Assembly would rather give the money than the flexibility. So that's where we are.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, thanks, Leah, because I think it does depend on your state funding model and what your, how it works. Because I know one of the other districts we featured, Ector County in Texas, they pretty much are budget. It's budget neutral. You have this set amount of money, and they kind of decide how, there's some district and then school level, but it is. So I think it really depends on how your state funding formula is. But kudos to North Carolina for trying to, come around a workaround essentially to still be able to do that. Funding flexibility is desirable, but one step at a time.
Right.
We do have a couple of questions.
Yeah. This first question is, and I'll buy you some time, Leah, has to do with kind of this. Why do you think North Carolina hasn't yet seen that impact on teacher retention? And I can't speak to the North Carolina case, but I know in Shannon and I's research, a lot of the data is new. These evaluations are ongoing, so a lot of that data just needs time to emerge. But I do believe that the Next Education Workforce Model in Arizona, obviously the hosts of this event we're at right now, I know they have at least some preliminary data, and I may be misspeaking. It might be less preliminary now, about teachers reporting desiring to stay in schools with the model longer, desired to be working on these next education workforce teams. So they are seeing some data, early data beginning to emerge that it is impacting teacher behavior in some ways. But Leah, interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of those things that's gnawing at me that we really want to see. I would say that I think when we've only been able to look school-wide data, because we haven't had the teacher level data that we've needed to do these drill downs to these ATR teams. So I'm really hopeful that in the fall evaluation that comes out this October, that we'll see that, because we will have that data for the first time. So in thinking about looking at, really challenging environments and high need schools where we know turnover is a problem. If we're looking across the entire school and not able to like isolate those teacher teams, I think that could explain that some of what's happening. Teachers who aren't on these teams are still experiencing the same sort of challenging environments, poor working conditions, and they're leaving, and then we're not seeing a shift in the retention or a significant shift in retention. I also think we've been having a little bit of conversations with the evaluators on like social emotional support that teachers need. Our model is really focused on the two roles are teachers who take on more kids and get paid just because they're excellent teachers and they get paid more to do more, and then teachers who lead teams. But even those teachers who lead teams, it's very academic. It's very much about planning and student curriculum and student data, and it's very academic. And so potentially maybe there's a missing social emotional support piece that we're not seeing. So we're kind of just noodling on that. I don't have a like definitive answer, but those are just some thoughts I have.
Leah, I think we've got time for like one more question, and a question from Noah just came in the chat that I think gives you the chance to talk a bit more about how ATR is structured. Is it a matter for each school or district to identify what the exact nature of these teaching roles looks like in each specific context? Or does the state prescribe in some manner kind of how these roles need to be used?
Yeah, so really great question. So our grant model grants money for districts to design their own program. So there's an RFP, but they're really designing what they want to see in their district. And even then, to Shannon's point, even when they have like the district will say, I've got these roles and these stipends and these are the qualifications for the roles, et cetera, et cetera. And then from school to school, each principal kind of has autonomy of like, I know I've got this much funding and I can afford these kinds of positions. And then they decide how to use those positions and deploy them based on the subject area need or the teachers who need most support. And so there is a lot of variation across our districts, and there's a lot of variation across schools, even within districts. What has happened with the salary supplement investment that the state made is that the state defined, like just 2 years ago, in 2023, a year and a half ago, they defined 2 specific roles that the state will fund the supplement for, and that's the team lead, person who's leading the team and responsible for the performance of the students on the team, where you really need the release time. And then the other one is the classroom excellence position, which is a person who's really great at teaching and assumes more students and gets paid for that. Now, the districts are fully allowed and encouraged to create additional positions outside of those sort of state-defined ones. But those are not, there's no state money for those positions. Now, the reason that the state did that is because they were doing that salary supplement investment, and otherwise we really wouldn't encourage you to define a position, because we would encourage you to give your districts the flexibility to do what they need to do and what works for their context.
Thank you so much, Leah. I think that essentially brings us to the end of our time here. I think we have like about a minute or so left. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. The chat has been absolutely blowing up with lots of folks adding their perspective, adding links to resources. Leah, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have the state perspective. Shannon dropped at the beginning of the session, but I'll also drop them in the chat before the window closes. Shannon and my contact information. If you have additional questions, please be sure to check out the Reimagining the Teaching Role website we built. Again, that contains all of the resources we talked about today and like a million more that we didn't get to. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I will pass it back to Casey.
Thank you, everyone. Huge gratitude, Shannon, Michael, and Leah, for being here with us today, for sharing all your wisdom and lived experience and the fantastic resources in the chat. To rate this session, please, participants, go back to your session agenda. You can click the number of stars you would like to award the session, and welcome any qualitative comments you have about your experience. Thank you all, and please enjoy the rest of Summit. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.